I stared at my phone screen in my empty kitchen, reading the text that just shattered my heart. Don't call or come to the wedding. We're done. It was from Sarah, my only daughter. 26 years old and getting married next weekend to some rich boy from Boston. 3 years since we last spoke. 3 years since my ex-wife Brenda poisoned her against me with lies. My weathered fingers typed my response. Got your last wish. Then I hit send on an email that would destroy everything they built on deception. That text wasn't really a surprise. I'd been expecting it ever since I found out about Sarah's engagement through a newspaper announcement 3 weeks ago. My own daughter's wedding, and I had to learn about it from the Columbus Dispatch. But that's how things had been for 3 long years, ever since Brenda convinced Sarah I was some kind of monster. The divorce 8 years ago was brutal. Brenda left me for Marcus Wellington, a wealthy businessman from Boston who owned half the construction contracts in Ohio. She claimed I was emotionally abusive and unstable due to my PTSD from my service in Afghanistan. The judge believed her tears and her expensive lawyer. I lost half my savings, but I never fought for more. I just wanted to protect Sarah from the ugliness. Brenda got primary custody, and slowly, methodically, she began erasing me from my daughter's life. First, it was missed visits because Sarah was too busy with school activities. Then it was shortened phone calls because I was upsetting her with my negativity. Finally, it was complete silence. For 3 years, I'd been sending birthday cards to Sarah's apartment in Boston, graduation gifts when she finished college, letters explaining my side of the story, begging for just one conversation. None of them ever reached her. I know because I hired a private investigator 6 months ago, Jimmy Foster, a former Marine who specialized in family cases. Jimmy's report was devastating. Every card, every letter, every gift I'd sent had been intercepted. Brenda had arranged with the Postal Service to forward all mail addressed to Sarah from my address directly to her house in Boston. My daughter never saw a single attempt I made to contact her. But it was worse than simple interception. Jimmy discovered that Brenda had told Sarah I didn't want contact with her anymore. She told my daughter I was starting a new family and had moved on with my life. Sarah believed her father had abandoned her voluntarily. The wedding announcement in the newspaper was deliberately kept from me. Jimmy found out that Brenda had specifically requested that no announcements be sent to addresses in central Ohio. She knew I still lived in Grove City, 30 minutes from Columbus, in the same house where Sarah grew up. The house I'd kept exactly as it was when she left for college, hoping she'd come home for Christmas breaks that never came. Sitting in my kitchen that morning, reading Sarah's text, I felt something break inside my chest. Not anger, not even sadness anymore. Just a cold, clear certainty that the time for playing defense was over. My daughter hated me for an abandonment I never committed. She was marrying into a family that had actively worked to erase me from her life. Jimmy Foster had given me more than just information about intercepted mail. He'd given me a roadmap to the truth about the Wellington family. And what I'd found in those reports was going to change everything. I looked at my phone again. Don't call or come to the wedding. We're done. 26 years of being her father, reduced to a text message dismissal. I opened my laptop and typed a single email. The recipient wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Brenda. It was Special Agent Catherine Mills of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. The email contained 2 words: execute nightfall. Then I sat back in my kitchen chair and waited for my daughter's phone to start blowing up. The nightfall operation had been 18 months in the making. It started when Jimmy Foster's background check on Bradley Wellington III, Sarah's fiancé, revealed some interesting connections. Bradley was the son of Marcus Wellington, the same man who'd married my ex-wife. The same man who'd been quietly using his political connections to run background checks on me. Marcus Wellington owned Wellington Construction, one of the largest government contractors in Ohio. They'd built everything from Veterans Affairs hospitals to federal courthouse annexes. What they'd also been doing, according to my contacts in military procurement, was systematically overbilling the government for materials and labor to the tune of about $2 million over 5 years. I'd learned about the fraud through a friend from my Army days, Colonel James Murphy, who now worked in the Pentagon's Contractor Oversight Division. James had mentioned Wellington Construction during a phone call, asking if I knew anything about Marcus Wellington personally. Seems like a solid businessman, James had said, but some of his invoices don't add up. We're looking into it. That's when the pieces started falling into place. Marcus Wellington wasn't just my ex-wife's husband. He was a federal contractor under investigation. And he'd been using his security clearance access to research my background, trying to find ammunition to use against me in family court. Through James, I learned that Marcus had attempted to access my sealed military records 3 times in the past 2 years. Each time, he'd claimed it was for a security assessment related to a potential government contract. The Pentagon had denied the requests, but they'd been logged. Marcus Wellington had been actively investigating me, looking for anything that might make me look dangerous or unstable. I realized they saw me as more than just an inconvenient ex-husband. They saw me as a liability, a working-class veteran who didn't fit the elite image the Wellington family was trying to maintain. Sarah's marriage to Bradley wasn't just about love. It was about completing her transformation from Ford Harrison's daughter into a proper Wellington family member. The deeper Jimmy Foster dug, the worse it got. Marcus and Brenda had been telling Sarah that I'd been investigated for security risks due to my military service. They'd convinced her that my PTSD made me potentially violent. They'd used my own honorable service to my country as evidence that I was dangerous. But the most calculated move was their plan to have Sarah legally change her last name from Harrison to Wellington before the marriage. Not after, like most women do with their husband's name. Before. They wanted to erase the Harrison name entirely, making Sarah officially a Wellington before she even said I do. That's when I decided to stop playing defense. My military training kicked in, and I started planning a counterattack. I reached out to Colonel Murphy and volunteered to help with the Wellington construction investigation. With my security clearance still active from my Army days, I was the perfect inside source. I could get close to Marcus Wellington through family connections without arousing suspicion. After all, I was just the unstable ex-husband trying to reconcile with his daughter's new family. For 6 months, I'd been documenting everything. Every overbilled invoice I could access through James. Every falsified material report. Every kickback payment, disguised as consulting fees. Marcus Wellington had built his empire on fraud, and I was going to use that fraud to destroy him. The Wellington family had spent 3 years painting me as the villain in Sarah's story. They'd convinced my daughter that I was dangerous, unstable, and unworthy of being in her life. They'd used their wealth and connections to isolate me from the only person who mattered to me in this world. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated what a soldier will do when you threaten his family. As I sat in my kitchen, waiting for Agent Mills to execute our operation, I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Sarah 3 years ago. She'd been 23, fresh out of college, and full of anger about things Brenda had told her I'd said and done, things that had never happened. "You abandoned us," she'd screamed at me over the phone. "You chose your own problems over your family." I'd tried to explain, tried to tell her about the PTSD therapy I was attending, about the progress I was making, about how much I loved her and wanted to be part of her life. But she'd already made up her mind. The last thing she said to me was, "Don't contact me anymore. I'm done being disappointed by you." Now, 3 years later, she'd made good on that threat. "Don't call or come to the wedding. We're done." But this time, I was ready for her. This time, I had the truth on my side, and the truth was about to blow up the Wellington family's carefully constructed world of lies. The plan Jimmy Foster uncovered 3 weeks before Sarah's wedding was the final straw. Hidden in a stack of legal documents he'd obtained through a contact at the Boston courthouse was something that made my blood run cold: adult adoption papers. Marcus and Brenda Wellington were planning to legally adopt Sarah after her marriage to Bradley. Adult adoption. At 26 years old, my daughter would become Sarah Wellington, not just through marriage, but through law. Legally, I would no longer be her father. Marcus Wellington would be. According to the paperwork, this was being done for her protection from my ongoing psychological instability. The documents cited fabricated incidents of harassment and stalking that had never happened. They referenced therapy sessions with Dr. Richard Thornton, a psychiatrist in Boston who was apparently treating Brenda for trauma related to threats from her former spouse. It took Jimmy Foster exactly 2 days to discover that Dr. Richard Thornton was Marcus Wellington's golf partner at the Brookline Country Club. The entire therapy narrative was fabricated specifically to create legal documentation supporting the adoption. But Jimmy's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Brenda had been embezzling money from the children's charity, where she worked as a financial administrator. The Sunshine Foundation provided support for families with children battling cancer. Over the past 4 years, Brenda had been systematically redirecting donation funds into personal accounts, stealing money meant to help dying children. The scheme was sophisticated. She would create fake vendor accounts for medical equipment and therapy services, then approve payments to these accounts. The money would flow through a series of shell companies before ending up in investment accounts she controlled. She'd stolen nearly $400,000 from families who were already facing the worst moments of their lives. Meanwhile, while Brenda was stealing from cancer families and Marcus was defrauding the government, they'd convinced Sarah to struggle financially for her own character development. Jimmy discovered that Sarah had taken out $60,000 in student loans for graduate school, even though her stepfather was worth several $1,000,000. She was working 2 part-time jobs, 16 hours a week at a coffee shop, and 12 hours at a tutoring center, trying to make ends meet. The Wellingtons were letting my daughter live paycheck to paycheck while they hoarded wealth stolen from taxpayers and dying children. They wanted her independent, so she would appreciate Bradley's family money when he proposed. It was all part of their psychological manipulation. But the cruelest discovery was what they'd done with the child support I'd been paying all these years. After the divorce, I'd faithfully sent $800 a month to support Sarah's expenses. I'd assumed Brenda was using it for Sarah's college costs and living expenses. She wasn't. She'd been depositing my child support payments into the same investment accounts she used for the stolen charity money. My own payments to help my daughter were funding Brenda's lavish lifestyle, while Sarah worked 2 jobs to afford groceries. The rage I felt when Jimmy showed me those financial records was unlike anything I'd experienced in Afghanistan. At least in war, you know who the enemy is. You can see them coming. But this was different. This was my daughter's own family, stealing from her, while convincing her that I was the one who'd abandoned her. Agent Mills and I had been planning the timing of the investigation carefully. We needed to execute before the wedding, when all the family assets would still be in Marcus's name. After the marriage, Bradley would have legal access to the accounts, and the money could disappear into offshore holdings. But we also needed Sarah to see the truth for herself. If we acted too early, Marcus and Brenda would have time to spin the story, to convince Sarah that I was somehow responsible for their legal troubles. The wedding invitation text was perfect timing. Sarah had finally cut me off completely, which meant she couldn't accuse me of manipulating the investigation to hurt her new family. My response to her text, "Got your last wish," wasn't just an acknowledgement of her rejection. It was the code phrase that would trigger Agent Mills to execute 18 months of federal investigation work. Within 6 hours of my email, FBI agents would be raiding Wellington construction offices in Boston and Columbus. IRS agents would be seizing financial records from Brenda's charity. Federal prosecutors would be filing charges for conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. Sarah's phone would be blowing up with news alerts, phone calls from confused friends, and media requests for comment. The Boston Globe had already been briefed on the story. The headline would read, "Wellington Construction CEO arrested in federal fraud investigation." Marcus Wellington would be arrested at his country club in front of 3 generations of Boston elite families. Brenda would be handcuffed at her desk while trying to delete financial records from the charity's computer system. And Sarah would finally learn the truth about who her real enemies had been all along. As I sat in my kitchen that evening, I thought about the last time I'd held my daughter. She was 12 years old, and we'd been working on her science fair project about solar energy. She'd been so proud when we got the little solar panel to power a tiny LED light. "We did it, Dad," she'd said, hugging me tight. "We made something that works." Now, 14 years later, I was about to make something work that would give her back the father they'd stolen from her. Even if she hated me for it at first, even if she couldn't understand why I'd had to let her believe I'd abandoned her, I was going to give her the truth. The Wellingtons had played a long game, slowly poisoning my daughter against me over 3 years of calculated lies. But I'd played a longer game. And tomorrow morning, when Sarah woke up and saw the news, she would finally understand that her father had never stopped fighting for her. The raids began at 6:30 in the morning, Boston time. Agent Mills called me at exactly 6:45 to confirm that both Marcus Wellington and Brenda had been arrested without incident. Wellington Construction's offices in Boston, Columbus, and Cincinnati were being searched by federal agents. The Sunshine Foundation had been closed pending investigation of the embezzlement charges. By 7:15, the story was breaking on every major news network in Ohio and Massachusetts. Millionaire contractor arrested in federal fraud investigation. Boston businessman accused of stealing from government, children's charity. Sarah's phone started ringing at 7:22. I know because Agent Mills was monitoring the situation, making sure Sarah wasn't contacted by Marcus or Brenda before they could fully understand what was happening. Jimmy Foster was positioned outside Sarah's apartment building in Cambridge, ready to intervene if anyone tried to reach her before the full story came out. What Sarah didn't know, what no one except Agent Mills and Colonel Murphy knew, was that I'd been working undercover with the FBI for 18 months. My emotional instability after the divorce had been an act. My apparent obsession with trying to contact Sarah had been a cover for my real work, gathering evidence against the Wellington criminal enterprise. Every time I'd tried to send Sarah a letter or birthday card, I'd actually been testing the mail interception system Brenda had set up. Every desperate phone call I'd made to Brenda, begging to speak with Sarah, had been recorded by FBI surveillance equipment. My apparent breakdown as a rejected father had given me the perfect cover to investigate the family that had stolen my daughter. The military intelligence training I'd received 25 years ago in the Army had served me well. Surveillance, evidence gathering, building a case file, establishing a paper trail, it was all second nature. Marcus Wellington thought he was dealing with a broken-down veteran with PTSD. He had no idea he was being hunted by someone who'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan tracking enemy networks. Agent Mills had been skeptical when I first approached the FBI. A recently divorced veteran claiming his ex-wife's new husband was committing federal fraud seemed like a revenge fantasy. But when I provided the initial evidence Colonel Murphy had given me, along with my own military credentials and security clearance, she'd agreed to let me work as an informant. For 18 months, I'd played the role of the obsessed ex-husband while systematically documenting every aspect of the Wellington financial crimes. I'd obtained access to Marcus's office building by claiming I wanted to deliver a letter to Sarah. I'd photographed invoice documents while Marcus was in the bathroom. I'd recorded conversations with Brenda, where she discussed keeping the crazy veteran away from Sarah. The hardest part wasn't the investigative work. It was letting Sarah hate me while I gathered the evidence that would eventually free her. Every month that passed without contact with my daughter felt like losing her all over again. But I knew that if I acted too soon, if I tried to expose the Wellingtons before I had irrefutable proof, they would use their wealth and connections to destroy any case against them. My last wish email to Agent Mills contained more than just the code word to execute the arrests. It included 18 months of evidence, financial records, recorded conversations, photographs of falsified invoices, bank routing information for the shell companies Brenda used to launder money. But the most damaging evidence was something Marcus Wellington had given me himself, without realizing it. During one of my pathetic visits to his office, begging to see Sarah, he'd shown me a file cabinet containing what he called insurance policies, documentation that could destroy business rivals and political enemies if necessary. He'd been threatening me with some of the contents, warning me that he had connections who could make my life very difficult. What Marcus didn't realize was that his insurance files also contained evidence of bribes he'd paid to government officials, kickbacks he'd received from subcontractors, and detailed records of the charity embezzlement scheme he'd helped Brenda design. He'd been so confident in his power over me that he'd essentially confessed to multiple federal crimes while trying to intimidate me. By 8 o'clock that morning, every major news outlet in New England was running the story. Marcus Wellington, prominent Boston businessman and government contractor, arrested on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. Brenda Wellington, financial administrator for a children's cancer charity, arrested for embezzlement and conspiracy. The Boston Globe had received an exclusive copy of the federal indictment, which detailed the scope of the fraud: $2.3 million stolen from government contracts, $420,000 embezzled from the children's charity, and additional charges related to tax evasion and wire fraud. But the story that would matter most to Sarah was buried in the 3rd paragraph of the Globe article. The investigation was initiated by a confidential informant with military intelligence experience who had been gathering evidence against the defendants for over 18 months. By 8:30, Sarah was calling the number she'd told me never to use again. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. "Hello, sweetheart?" There was silence for 30 seconds. Then, in a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years, my daughter whispered, "Dad, what have you done?" "I gave you your last wish," I said quietly. "I shut them up forever." And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah laughed. Not a happy laugh. A shocked, disbelieving laugh that told me she was finally beginning to understand that everything she'd believed about her father was a lie. "Dad," she said, and her voice was shaking, "I need to see you. Right now. There's something I have to tell you about what they've been saying, about what I believed." "I know, sweetheart," I said. "I've always known. And I've been waiting for this phone call for 1,095 days. How did you?" She started to ask, then stopped. "Oh God, Dad. How long have you been planning this?" "Since the day you told me we were done," I said. I've been working to get you back ever since. Sarah drove from Boston to Grove City in 4.5 hours, breaking multiple speed limits. She called me twice during the drive, once from a rest stop in Hartford where she'd been crying too hard to continue safely, and once from the Pennsylvania border where she'd stopped to buy tissues and coffee. I found them, Dad, she said during the second call. The letters, the birthday cards, all of them. They were in a storage box in Mom's closet. I went to the house after I called you, and I found everything. I'd been expecting that. Brenda would have kept the intercepted mail as evidence of my harassment in case she ever needed it for legal proceedings. She never imagined Sarah would be searching the house after Marcus's arrest. When Sarah arrived at my house at 3:30 that afternoon, she was carrying a cardboard box that contained 3 years of my attempts to maintain contact with her. Birthday cards I'd sent for her 23rd, 24th, and 25th birthdays. Christmas presents that had never been delivered. Letters I'd written explaining my side of the divorce story. But the most devastating discovery was what she found in Marcus's home office. Legal documents that revealed the full scope of their plan to erase me from her life. The adult adoption papers were just the beginning. They'd also prepared a restraining order petition claiming I'd been stalking Sarah, complete with falsified evidence and fabricated witness statements. Dad, they were going to have you arrested, Sarah said, sitting at my kitchen table with the card box between us. The day after my wedding, they were going to file papers claiming you'd been threatening me. Dr. Thornton was going to testify that I was in therapy for trauma caused by your harassment. I pulled out the manila envelope I'd been keeping in my desk drawer for 6 months. Inside were copies of all the FBI recordings I'd made during my investigation. Listen to this, I said, connecting my phone to a small speaker. The recording was from 14 months ago, Brenda's voice crystal clear. The important thing is that Sarah never finds out Ford has been trying to contact her. If she knew he'd been sending letters and gifts, she might start feeling guilty about cutting him off. We need her to believe he doesn't want a relationship with her. Marcus's voice came through next. The adoption papers will take care of the legal issues. Once she's officially my daughter, Ford Harrison won't have any parental rights. He'll be a stranger, with no legal standing to interfere in her life. Sarah listened to 40 minutes of recordings, her face growing paler with each revelation, her parents discussing the mail interception system, Marcus explaining how he'd used his government connections to research my background, Brenda describing her plan to use the charity embezzlement money to fund Sarah's wedding, making sure she felt grateful to the Wellington family for their generosity. The cruelest recording was Brenda talking to Dr. Thornton about the fabricated therapy sessions. We need documented evidence that Sarah is traumatized by Ford's behavior. I know there haven't been any actual incidents, but we need you to create a clinical record showing ongoing psychological damage. Sarah doesn't need to know about the therapy sessions. We'll just use them for the legal paperwork. When the recordings finished, Sarah sat in silence for 10 minutes. Finally, she looked up at me with eyes that looked exactly like they had when she was 12 years old. Dad, how long have you known all of this? I suspected something was wrong when you stopped returning my calls 3 years ago, I said. But I didn't know the full extent until about 6 months ago, when I hired Jimmy Foster to investigate. Jimmy Foster? Private investigator. Former Marine. He's the one who discovered the mail interception and the financial crimes. Sarah pulled a thick folder from her backpack. Dad, there's more. I found financial records in Marcus's safe. He's been stealing the child support you've been sending me. For 3 years, I thought you'd stop supporting me financially. I've been working 2 jobs and taking out student loans while he was investing your money in his own accounts. That hit me harder than I'd expected. Sweetheart, I've been sending $800 a month since the divorce. I never stopped. I never saw any of it, she whispered. I've been living on ramen noodles and coffee shop tips while they stole the money you were sending to help me. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a different folder. Sarah, there's something else you need to know. I've been putting money into a college fund for you since you graduated high school. It's in a separate account that Brenda couldn't access. There's about $40,000 in it now. Sarah stared at the bank statements I handed her. Dad, why didn't you tell me about this when I was struggling to pay for graduate school? Because they'd convinced you that I was dangerous and unstable. If I'd tried to give you money directly, they would have used it as evidence that I was trying to manipulate you. I needed you to be safe from them before I could help you financially. For the next 2 hours, Sarah went through every document I'd collected during the investigation. Financial records showing the scope of Marcus's fraud. Evidence of Brenda's embezzlement from the children's charity. Photographs of the intercepted mail. Transcripts of the recorded conversations. But the most emotional moment came When she found something I'd almost forgotten was in the box, a copy of her high school graduation program. In the margin, written in my handwriting, was row 12, seat 8. Perfect view of my brilliant daughter. Dad, you were there? In the parking lot, I admitted. Brenda had me banned from the school grounds, but I watched the entire ceremony through the gymnasium windows. You gave the best valedictorian speech I've ever heard. Sarah started crying then, really crying for the first time since she'd arrived. Dad, I thought you didn't care. For 3 years, I thought you'd just moved on with your life and forgotten about me. Sweetheart, you're my only child. You're the only thing in this world that matters to me. I would never move on from you. As the sun was setting, Sarah asked the question I'd been dreading. Dad, what's going to happen to them? To Mom and Marcus? They're going to prison, I said simply. Marcus is looking at 15 to 20 years for the federal fraud charges. Brenda will probably get 8 to 10 years for the embezzlement. There's also restitution involved. Restitution? The government will seize all of Marcus's assets to pay back what he stole. But here's the thing, Sarah. Legally, you're his stepdaughter. You're entitled to claim compensation for the financial support they denied you. That could mean the house, the cars, the investment accounts. Sarah looked shocked. Dad, I don't want their money. It's not their money, I said gently. It's stolen money that should be returned to the taxpayers and the children's charity. But the law also recognizes that you were harmed by their actions. You have a right to restitution for the 3 years of lies and financial manipulation. That night, Sarah slept in her childhood bedroom for the first time in 8 years. I'd kept everything exactly as she'd left it when she went to college. Her books, her posters, even her stuffed animals. She found a photo album I'd maintained with pictures from every important event in her life since the divorce, including shots I'd taken from the parking lot at her college graduation. Before she went to bed, Sarah asked one more question. Dad, are you proud of me? Despite everything, despite believing them instead of trusting you, are you proud of who I've become? I hugged her for the first time in 3 years. Sweetheart, I've been proud of you every single day since you were born. Nothing that happened between us was your fault. You were manipulated by people who were supposed to protect you. The fact that you're here now, asking these questions, shows me exactly the kind of person you've become. And yes, I'm proud of you. As she headed upstairs to her room, Sarah turned back to me. Dad, tomorrow, I need to call Bradley and tell him the wedding is off. Are you sure about that? After everything I've learned today? Dad, I could never marry someone whose family destroyed our relationship. Besides, I think I'm about to find out what Bradley Wellington is really like when his family's money disappears. She was right about that. The next day would bring revelations about Bradley Wellington III that would shock even me. Bradley Wellington III's true character revealed itself exactly 18 hours after his father's arrest. Sarah called him at 9 o'clock the next morning from my kitchen, planning to gently explain that the wedding needed to be postponed while the legal situation was resolved. Bradley's response was immediate and vicious. This is all your fault, Sarah. Your psychotic father destroyed my family's reputation with his revenge fantasy investigation. I was sitting across from Sarah at the kitchen table, and even I could hear Bradley's voice through her phone. Sarah put the call on speaker, so I could listen to my future son-in-law's true personality. Bradley, your father stole over $2 million from the government, Sarah said quietly. My dad didn't make that up. Your dad's a loser veteran who couldn't handle being replaced by a successful man, Bradley shot back. He's been planning this for years because he was jealous of what we built. What you built? Sarah's voice was getting stronger. You mean what your father built by stealing from taxpayers and children with cancer? Look, Sarah, here's the situation. My dad made some accounting mistakes with government contracts. It happens in business. But your father turned it into this federal case because he wanted to hurt our family. And now you need to choose whose side you're on. That's when the mask came completely off. For the next 20 minutes, Bradley revealed everything about his true feelings towards Sarah and his motivations for proposing to her. He admitted that he'd known about the government contract irregularities for over a year, but hadn't cared because that's how business works in the real world. He told Sarah that he'd only proposed because Marcus had promised him control of Wellington Construction after the wedding. He revealed that the entire courtship had been orchestrated by Marcus as a way to give Bradley a starter wife before he inherited the family business. But the cruelest revelation was what he said about Sarah's financial struggles. Do you think I didn't know you were working in a coffee shop? Bradley laughed. My dad thought it was hilarious that you were so independent and hardworking while we had millions in the bank. He said it would make you more grateful when you finally got access to real money. Sarah's face went white. You knew I was struggling to pay my bills, and you thought it was funny? Sarah, you were never struggling. You were being tested. My dad wanted to make sure you weren't a gold digger before we let you into the family. Working those little jobs was like an audition to prove you deserved to marry a Wellington. I watched my daughter's expression change, from hurt to disgust to pure anger. Bradley, are you telling me that you watched me eat ramen noodles for dinner and work 16-hour days while your family had money they'd stolen from cancer patients? Oh, come on, Sarah. Don't be so dramatic. You got good experience in the service industry. Character building. That's when Sarah found her voice. Character building? Bradley, your father embezzled $400,000 from families whose children are dying. Your family spent stolen money on country club memberships while I was donating plasma to pay my rent. Look, sweetheart, that's all in the past now. The important thing is what happens next. If you stand by me through this legal trouble, if you marry me despite what your father did to us, I promise I'll take care of you financially. But if you choose your father's side over mine, then you're choosing to be poor forever. Sarah looked across the table at me, and I saw something in her eyes that reminded me of the 12-year-old who'd figured out how to make that solar panel work. My daughter was solving a problem. Bradley, she said calmly, let me make sure I understand your offer. If I marry you despite your family's criminal behavior, you'll support me financially with money your father stole from cancer patients and taxpayers. But if I choose to have a relationship with my father, the man who spent 18 months gathering evidence to expose your family's crimes, then I'll be poor forever. Exactly. I'm glad you understand how this works. Sarah smiled, and it was not a nice smile. Bradley, I have another option you haven't considered. Option 3 is that I take the restitution money from your father's seized assets, which I'm legally entitled to as compensation for 3 years of financial and emotional abuse, and I use that money to finish graduate school while rebuilding a relationship with the father who never stopped fighting for me. The silence on Bradley's end of the call lasted almost 30 seconds. What restitution money? He finally asked, and for the first time he sounded worried. The FBI seized all of your father's assets yesterday. The house, the cars, the investment accounts, the business. As Marcus's stepdaughter, I'm entitled to compensation for the harm his criminal actions caused me. My father estimates it's worth about $600,000. Sarah, that's my inheritance. That money belongs to the Wellington family. Bradley, that money belongs to the American taxpayers and the families your father stole from. But the law also provides compensation for victims of financial fraud. I was definitely a victim. You can't do this to me, Sarah. Without that inheritance, I don't have anything. I don't even have a trust fund. Everything was tied up in my dad's business. And there it was. Bradley Wellington III, the man who'd been courting my daughter for 2 years, had never loved her. He'd been courting Marcus's money. Without the stolen funds, Bradley had no wealth, no prospects, and no reason to pretend he cared about Sarah. Bradley, Sarah said, the wedding is off. I'm also returning your engagement ring, since it was probably purchased with stolen charity money. Sarah, wait, we can work this out. Maybe your father and I got off on the wrong foot. Maybe I was too quick to blame him for what happened. But Sarah had already made up her mind. Bradley, yesterday I thought my father had abandoned me, and I was marrying into a family that truly loved me. Today I know my father spent 18 months working undercover to protect me from criminals who were manipulating me. The choice is pretty clear. She hung up the phone and immediately pulled off the engagement ring. Dad, do you think the FBI would like to have this as evidence? I'm pretty sure it came from the stolen charity money. I looked at the ring, a 3-carat diamond in a platinum setting that probably cost $40,000. I think Agent Mills would definitely be interested in that. 2 hours later, Sarah and I drove to the FBI field office in Columbus to turn over the engagement ring and sign additional statements about the financial abuse she'd suffered. Agent Mills explained that Sarah's restitution claim was solid and would probably result in her receiving most of Marcus's remaining assets after the government recovered what was owed to taxpayers. That afternoon, the Boston Globe published a follow-up story with a devastating headline: Wellington Wedding Called Off as Bride Learns of Family's Criminal Scheme. The article included quotes from Sarah about discovering the intercepted mail and learning about the financial manipulation. But the most satisfying moment came that evening, when Sarah called the wedding venue to officially cancel the ceremony. The venue coordinator was sympathetic until Sarah explained why the wedding was canceled. "Ma'am, I'm actually glad you called," the coordinator said. "The Wellington family's credit cards were all declined yesterday when we tried to process the final payment. We were going to have to cancel the event anyway. Even Bradley's wedding was paid for with stolen money." That night, Sarah and I sat on the front porch of our house in Grove City, drinking coffee and watching the sun set. For the first time in 3 years, I was talking with my daughter about her future, her dreams, her plans for graduate school. "Dad," she said as we were heading inside, "I need to ask you something. Are you angry with me? For believing them? For cutting you out of my life?" I stopped walking and looked at my 26-year-old daughter, who looked so much like her mother had at that age, back when Brenda and I were happy and Sarah was just a dream we shared. "Sweetheart, you were manipulated by criminals who spent 3 years systematically destroying your trust in me. You were a victim, not a perpetrator. I could never be angry with you for being deceived by people you should have been able to trust. But I should have known better. I should have questioned their stories about you. Sarah, they had intercepted mail, falsified therapy records, and financial documentation to support everything they told you. They weren't just lying to you. They were running a sophisticated psychological operation designed to isolate you from me. Even trained investigators can be fooled by that level of deception." As we walked into the house, Sarah asked one final question. "Dad, what happens now? To us, I mean. Do we just pick up where we left off 3 years ago?" I thought about that for a moment. "No, sweetheart. We don't pick up where we left off. We start over. We build something new, something better, something based on truth instead of lies." The next morning would bring new challenges and new revelations. But that night, for the first time in 3 years, my daughter was sleeping safely under my roof, and the people who'd tried to destroy our family were in federal custody. Justice wasn't just served. It was delivered with precision, patience, and the kind of strategic planning that only comes from loving someone more than you love yourself. 1 year later, Sarah graduated magna cum laude from Boston University's graduate program in social work, specializing in family counseling. I sat in the front row of the graduation ceremony, wearing my dress uniform from my Army days, watching my daughter walk across the stage to receive her master's degree. The restitution money from Marcus's seized assets had paid for her final year of school, but more importantly, it had given her the financial freedom to choose a career, helping families damaged by manipulation and abuse. Sarah's thesis project was a counseling program for children whose parents had been incarcerated for white-collar crimes. "I want to help kids who've been lied to by the people they trusted most," she'd told me, while writing her thesis proposal. "I know what that feels like, and I know how to help them heal." Marcus Wellington was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Brenda received 12 years. They'd both tried to negotiate reduced sentences by claiming they were protecting Sarah from my dangerous instability, but the recorded conversations I'd provided to the FBI made their manipulation clear to the judge. Bradley Wellington III had disappeared entirely after the family money ran out. The last Sarah heard, he was working at a car dealership in Phoenix, trying to rebuild his life without stolen funds to support him. But the most meaningful change was what happened between Sarah and me. We didn't just resume our relationship where it had ended 3 years earlier. We built something entirely new, something stronger and more honest than what we'd had before. Every Sunday, Sarah drove down from Boston to have dinner with me in Grove City. We'd cook together, work on home improvement projects, and talk about everything we'd missed during those 3 lost years. Sarah helped me understand how the manipulation had affected her, and I helped her develop strategies for recognizing psychological abuse in her future relationships. We also started new traditions. Sarah convinced me to adopt a rescue dog, a German Shepherd mix named Scout, who'd been abandoned by his previous family. "Dad," she'd said, "Scout needs someone who understands what it's like to be loyal, even when loyalty isn't returned." Together, Sarah and I volunteered at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Columbus, where I helped other veterans deal with PTSD, and she counseled their family members who'd been affected by combat trauma. It was healing work for both of us. The most surprising development was Sarah's relationship with Jimmy Foster, the private investigator who'd helped expose the Wellington crimes. Jimmy was 15 years older than Sarah, a divorced father of 2 teenage sons, but they'd connected over their shared experience of family betrayal. Jimmy's ex-wife had also used their children as weapons during their divorce. "Dad," Sarah told me, 6 months after the investigation ended, "Jimmy understands what it's like to fight for someone who doesn't know you're fighting for them." Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the financial manipulation that had characterized her engagement to Bradley. When Jimmy proposed to Sarah on Christmas morning at my kitchen table, with my full blessing and a ring he'd saved for months to afford, I knew my daughter had finally found someone who loved her for exactly who she was. The wedding was everything Sarah's first engagement had not been. Small, honest, and paid for, with money that hadn't been stolen from anyone. We held the ceremony in my backyard in Grove City, with 40 guests who genuinely cared about Sarah's happiness. Colonel Murphy flew in from Washington to walk Sarah down the aisle alongside me. Agent Mills served as Sarah's maid of honor. During the ceremony, Sarah surprised me by asking the officiant to recognize something she called the guardian's promise. She asked me to stand and repeat after her. I promise to always fight for my family, even when they can't fight for themselves. I promise to choose truth over peace and justice over comfort. Then she turned to the wedding guests and said, "My father spent 18 months working undercover to expose the criminals who were manipulating me. He let me hate him so that I could eventually be free." That's what real love looks like. There wasn't a dry eye in the backyard. 2 years after the investigation ended, Sarah and Jimmy started a nonprofit organization called Truth and Reconciliation Family Services, providing counseling and legal support for families torn apart by manipulation, fraud, and abuse. They work primarily with military families and white-collar crime victims. The organization's motto, painted on the wall of their office in downtown Columbus, reads, "Some battles are fought in silence. Some victories take years to achieve. Real love never gives up." Today, Sarah is 30 years old, happily married, and working to help other families heal from the kind of damage that was inflicted on us. She calls me every Tuesday evening to check in, visits every Sunday for dinner, and includes me in every major decision in her life. But the most meaningful moment came last month, when Sarah told me she was pregnant with her first child. "Dad," she said, "I want to name him Ford, after the grandfather who taught me that love sometimes means making sacrifices that aren't understood until later." I told her that was the greatest honor anyone had ever given me. The lesson I learned from this experience isn't about revenge or justice, though both were served. It's about the patience required for real love. Sometimes protecting the people you care about means letting them misunderstand your actions for years. Sometimes winning means losing everything visible while fighting an invisible war. The Wellington family thought they could erase me from Sarah's life by controlling the narrative, intercepting communications, and manipulating her perception of reality. They thought wealth and connections were more powerful than a father's love. They were wrong. Love doesn't give up. Love doesn't quit. And sometimes, love fights back with a precision and dedication that criminals can never understand. My daughter's text message said, "Don't call or come to the wedding. We're done." She thought she was ending our relationship forever. Instead, she was giving me permission to save her life. I want to ask you something important. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between being understood and doing what was right? Maybe you've had to make a decision that seemed harsh or cold on the surface, but was actually the most loving thing you could do for someone you cared about. If you have a story about fighting for family, even when it was difficult or misunderstood, please share it in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else who's facing a similar choice. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about family, justice, and the complicated decisions we sometimes have to make for the people we love. Share this with anyone who might need to be reminded that real love never gives up, even in the darkest moments. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that truth has a way of surfacing, justice has a way of prevailing, and love has a way of winning, even when the battle takes longer than anyone expected. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.